First thing we're going to do is prepare the microscope for use. So before you even begin to think about viewing a specimen, there should be a few things that you check. The first thing is whether or not you have an objective lens in place. The microscope is stored properly, then there is no objective lens here, so you're going to want to turn to the 10x objective. The second thing you want to check is the position of the condenser using this condenser turret. Here on the side, there's a little thing it should read J. So you're going to turn the turret until it says J, okay? And just to check, look down inside the condenser and see if you see the proper iris diaphragm, and you do. The next thing you want to do is you're going to want to raise the stage to its highest position. This is okay because with this objective, the lens and the slide will never come in contact. However, with other objectives, you should never do this. Okay? You're also going to make sure that the condenser is in its highest position, which it already should be if the microscope is stored properly. And finally, you're going to want to open the lamp diaphragm and the iris diaphragm to its highest position so that maximum light enters your specimen. All right? You'll then adjust the illumination to a level that's comfortable for your eyes. Once the microscope is set up for use, we're going to do the Kohler illumination steps. So the first thing you want to do is you're going to take a clean glass microscope slide and mark it with a wax letter, preferably one that looks differently when it's upside down or if it's backwards. I prefer the letter R, but there are other letters that would fill this role. You can then push back the stage clip here and slide your wax letter R into the specimen holder, and then move the wax letter so that the wax is between the condenser and the objective. And then, using the coarse focusing knob, you're going to lower the stage until the wax comes into focus. And then you can use the fine focus adjustment to make sure that the wax is clearly in focus. Why you have to make sure that you lower the stage first before you do anything else to focus the specimen is because in the next stage, we're going to start making manipulations to the condenser. And you'll notice when I move the stage up and down, the condenser moved with it. When I move the condenser independently, the stage remains in the same spot. So it's really important that we get the stage in the correct position first before we then adjust the condenser. All right, so here we go down, make sure that's well focused. To make adjustments to the condenser, the first thing we need to do is to close the lamp diaphragm. When we make adjustments to the condenser, what we're trying to do is see if the condenser is properly focused on the lamp to provide the completely defocused light that's required for adequate viewing. And so in that case, we close the lamp diaphragm so that it gives us something other than the photons coming from the lamp to focus on. When we do that, we see in our field of view a small or blurry circle with a peacock blue edge. What we're looking at right now is actually the edges of the lamp diaphragm. When you look at the lamp diaphragm from outside the microscope, you can clearly see that the lamp diaphragm isn't a circle, but is instead a polygon. And so that is telling us that the condenser lens is out of focus over the lamp. So to put it into focus, we have to slowly lower the condenser so that our fuzzy blue circle turns into a sharply focused polygon with a similar peacock blue edge. Something else you might notice about this diaphragm is that it is probably not directly in the center of your field. So to have adequate Kohler illumination, you have to make sure that the condenser is directly over the center of the lamp, which is fixed in position. So in order to move this whole unit so that it's directly over the center of the lamp, we need to use the angled condenser centering screws. On this particular microscope, the standard microscope, the condenser centering screws are in the back. However, in some models of this microscope, the condenser angled centering screws are in front. And so when we do that, we're able to use both screws to more or less approximate the center of the lamp. To check its centering, we're going to open the lamp diaphragm slowly so that the edges of the lamp diaphragm touch the edges of our field of view. And what we'll see sometimes, if your centering isn't perfect, that you'll see that the lamp isn't quite as centered as you thought it was previously. So to address this, you can use the angled centering screws a little bit more to make sure that the edges of the lamp diaphragm make points of contact all along your field of view. Once you've confirmed that it's centered, then you can open the lamp diaphragm just enough so that the edges of the lamp diaphragm exceed your field of view. All right, so once you've achieved a clearly focused condenser to the lamp diaphragm and the specimen is well focused, you can now move on to the next stage of your microscopic venture, if you will. And so we've officially completed the first of the Kohler illumination steps. You remove the wax letter, and then we can move on to the next stage, which is to mess around with the diaphragm that's inside the condenser. And so before we make any manipulations to that diaphragm, we need to ask ourselves which type of microscopy are we doing and at which magnification are we going to be doing it. So the first thing I'm going to do is to prepare the microscope for use in bright field at all magnifications. All right? So in bright field, we need to make sure the condenser setting remains on J, okay? And we need to properly size the iris diaphragm that's inside of the condenser housing. Right now, the iris diaphragm is completely open. So just like with the lamp diaphragm, if we want to focus on it or see it, well, first we're going to have to close it. So close that that iris diaphragm all the way down so that it's as small as it can be. Okay. Once it's completely closed, if you look in the oculars at this point, you still don't see anything, and that's because the microscope is calibrated to focus on a real image that's made by both the objective lens and the ocular lens. And so if you want to see what's inside the condenser, you actually have to take the ocular lens out of the binocular tube. When you take a lens out of a microscope, you should always have another lens to put in, and you should never rest the ocular lens on the bench, because when it's on the bench, it can end up on the floor. It should be placed back into the jar or canister or box that the telescope lens was kept in. Now, when you look through the telescope lens, you might see one of two things. You might see already a well-focused polygon, or you might see something that's blurry and hard to see. If it's blurry, you can simply focus the telescope by either turning the centering telescope with respect to the tubing, or some brands require that you pull it. In either case, you get that well-centered, well-focused. And then the goal of that is to now center it. Again, what we're doing is trying to center the iris directly over the center of the lamp, directly over the center of the condenser lens. To do this centering, we want to make sure we don't do a couple of things. One, we never ever want to use the coarse focus knob again. We're done using that knob for the remainder of our session. We don't want to use the condenser focusing knob either, because we've already taken steps to focus the condenser, and we don't want to use the condenser centering screws again, because we've already made steps to center the condenser properly. So those three knobs are off limits, as well as the lamp diaphragm, which we've already adjusted to the proper width. So we need to use two additional screws in order to center the iris over the condenser lens and lamp. And so to do that, we're going to use this front screw called the knurled centering screw, and we're also going to use this side lever called the clamping lever. The clamping lever moves side to side, and the knurled centering screw moves up and down, or back and forth. And what we'll do, just similar to the condenser centering screws, is we'll use these two screws to position that iris diaphragm directly in the center of our field of view. Once it's centered, you use the knurled clamping lever locking nut to lock it into position. so they can't be moved again. And then we're going to open the iris diaphragm because, again, right now we're restricting the amount of light that passes through our specimen and we want ample light. So we open the iris diaphragm to about 4/5 of our field of view. And then we'll be ready to view our specimen in bright field at low power. In a microbiology laboratory, however, we don't usually use the microscope at low power because we're looking at very small beings. And so to view them, we're going to have to increase in magnification. However, when you increase in magnification, if you look through the telescope, you'll notice that the apparent size of the iris diaphragm decreases in magnification. Okay? And that means that there needs to be an adjustment that's made at every increase in magnification so that our field of view is filled with 4/5 of light. And so in this case, at 400 times magnification, we increase so that we have a field of view that's 80% full. And if we're using the microscope at high power, our field of view is even smaller, so we have to increase it even further so that we have an adequate field of view. All right, so we get enough light to see our specimen. And so if we were then to view our specimen, we would put our specimen back on the stage without making any adjustments to the height of the stage. You can then put your specimen back on there and then view it at low, medium, or high power, and at no point should the lens make contact with the specimen. But let's say you set up your microscope and you weren't planning to use it for bright field, but instead we're planning to use it for phase contrast. Well, phase contrast is very different from bright field because we have to change the condenser setting for every every magnification that we plan to use. So if we wish to view our specimen at medium, or what we call high drive magnification, we have to change our condenser setting. To what, you ask? Well, you have to look at the lens for the proper information. So here on the lens, you'll see pH2. pH2 tells us that we need the condenser setting 2 on this particular microscope in order for us to be successful in phase contrast. So we change our condenser turret setting to pH2. Once we do that, we can then put in our telescope lens again. And inside here, we should see 2 rings, a shadow ring and a light ring. At this stage, they may or may not be superimposed onto each other. If they're not superimposed, all right, then it's your job to superimpose them. So we'll use the clamping lever, just like we used previously, and the knurled screw. So with that, you can just turn that until the light ring is completely enveloped by what we call the shadow ring. When I talk about light ring, what I'm talking about is this ring that's present that you can see down in the condenser. That ring allows light to come up through the condenser. The shadow ring that you observe is housed within the objective lens and it's called a phase plate. It's important that the light ring and the phase plate be perfectly superimposed for you to be able to get a clear image in phase contrast. If you're working with a bacterial specimen and you viewed it at 400 times magnification, now you want to view it at higher magnification, you're going to have to do the phase ring alignment again at high power. All right? So here we are. We switch our lens to the phase setting on this lens, which happens to be pH3. So we'll set our condenser to 3, and then we'll do our phase ring alignment at that magnification. So here our phase rings are not well aligned. And so now they're well aligned and can be used for phase contrast at this magnification. So whenever you change condenser settings, you have to reinsert the telescope and do additional adjustments. Now we're ready to view our specimen in phase contrast. All right, so when we finish using the microscope, we have to make sure that the microscope is properly put away. So the first thing you're going to want to do is to make sure that all the lenses, the first thing you want to do is lower the stage to its lowest position to avoid the possibility that any objective might collide with the lens or any of the components of the condenser. You're going to turn the lamp completely off, and you're going to move the objective out of position. You want to make sure all the lenses are clean, so you're going to want to take a piece of clean lens paper and you're going to clean all the objectives, starting first with the ones that should not have any immersion oil. Okay, so 10x, followed by 40x, and finally the 100x, which is often covered in immersion oil. Make sure you remove all of that. The long oil on the lens can cause damage. Any other extraneous drops of oil, either on the lens or on the stage, wipe off after the fact. Make sure you clean everything very well. All right. Now that everything is lowered, you also want to make sure the condenser is in its highest position. You're going to unplug the microscope, and then you're going to wrap the cord about your hand, and you're going to store it alongside the microscope. All of our microscopes have a cover, so you replace the dust cover to keep the microscope clean. And then carrying the microscope by the arm and the base, you replace the microscope into the cabinet, just like this, storing the microscope's cord alongside the microscope. Make sure that you close, put all your things away, close and lock the cabinet